Thank you, everybody. It is great to be back here. I sort of joke, when the pandemic started, I asked my wife if we could move to New Zealand, and she's from Nebraska. And not a chance. You can go by yourself, she said. All right, so if you haven't heard, there's a book that came out. And I'm going to tell the story of this book. It's a novel, but it really started with a group of people who were trying to solve a problem around sort of automated governance, modern governance, called GRC, whatever you want to call it. Just a little bit about me. If you don't know who I am, I won't spend too much time, but I've done quite a few books. I think I counted, it's like 12 books. I've done 12 startups. For about 30 years, I failed miserably in my startups. In fact, one of the curses was my first startup at like 21 was successful. Like, don't do that. Because then for the next 25 years, like I was miserable failures. But like, whatever doesn't kill you, make you stronger. I'm probably most known for the co-author of DevOps Handbook. Although Gene and I did, Gene Kim, the author of the Phoenix Project, we did a Beyond the Phoenix Project, which was an audio only. The core of this story starts with that green book, and I'll talk about it a little later. It's a reference, it's not really a book. And then there's another sort of side story by a networking group that sort of took that and rolled into automated cloud governance. If you want to talk about that later, I don't really have time to cover that here. And then the book that really most of this presentation is about is called Investments Unlimited. And there's no such thing as, basically, there's no shameless plug. They're just plugs. So I'm going to talk about a new book that I have coming out at the end of this year about Dr. Deming. It's been my 10-year labor of love. A couple of the companies I've worked for, I've done a lot of startups. I was the first cloud, back pre-OpenStack at Canonical. I was, I think, 9th person in at Chef. I sold a company to Dell. I sold a company to Docker. I spent 3 years on an executive team at Red Hat. And now I'm with a startup called Costly, and I'll talk about that a little later, but it's not really a presentation about Costly. And then I was really early in on the DevOps Day thing. I was the only American at the first DevOps Days in Ghent. I was one of the core organizers of Gene Kim's DevOps Enterprise Summit, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if you've heard this quote before. Why do we care about automated governance, or I call it modern governance. Some people call it continuous compliance. Pick your flavor. Well, in 2011, Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, Andreessen Horowitz, probably one of the most prominent investment firms in the world, but certainly in Silicon Valley. He said that software is eating the world, and like he nailed it in 2011. And then my good friend Josh Corman, who's a white hat hacker, has done incredible things, worked on CISA, the cybersecurity, on the Homeland Security, and been a great mentor to me. He says software is infecting the world, right? He didn't mean that in like we can't turn back. It's not like, let's all this open source stuff, let's stop it right now because the dependency map is such a mess, right? Which it is. No, but the point is we should acknowledge that along with software eating the world, software is infecting the world. And then you sort of get into the poor banks of the world. And I say this with incredible respect because I spent a lot of time at large institutions, large banks. A lot of those ones that are highly regulated, I mean top 5 banks, I mean banks that have asset holdings in the 2 trillion plus, right? They feel like DevOps has left them behind. I mean, there's parts of their things that they can do all DevOps, digital properties, but the core banking services, they feel like there's these sort of, the world talks about doing this and doing fast and doing crazy stuff. They're still in a step function mode in most cases. Software releases in some of the top banks in the world still take days and weeks and months. We talk about 8 billion deploys a day or an hour in some places, which is kind of silly, but. And then there's a loss of competitive advantage. As the higher you get up, the bigger the bank you are. And it's not just banks, right? It's any highly regulated. But banks, what Dylan just said, it's where the money is, right? And here's the thing, if you take one message away from this presentation, AppSec, DevSecOps, and I sort of started the first DevSecOps day with Mark Miller at Sonatype. So it's not like I disrespect DevSecOps. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient because it doesn't solve the IT risk internal audit problems. And I'll get into that a little later. That's the premise for this book that we wrote and why I've been so passionate about this whole idea. We've left IT risk. If you heard the 3 ODL, three lines of defense, or DL, right? The second and third line in most larger banks are still like we were pre-DevOps with DevOps. This book, the genesis of this book is Gene Kim invites, about 50 of us. Gene Kim is the author of the Phoenix Project. If you don't know, you probably should have read it by now. I mean, if you're at a DevOps conference, like, I don't make any money off. I do off the DevOps handbook, but it's a sort of a core lighthouse book for like why we're here today, in my opinion. He started very early with the first DevOps Enterprise Summit, inviting a bunch of the speakers and core organizers to take surveys and see if we couldn't meet like 4 or 5 months later, where he lives in Portland, Oregon, and we try to turn those into sort of research papers. There's probably about 100 of them, all Creative Commons, and it's incredible wealth. It's not just security, it's like everything. It's written by some of the giant leaders in our industry who have been playing and experimenting with DevOps for like as long as it existed. So in the case of this book, the Investments Unlimited book, in 2015, a couple of us got together and started thinking about, like the early story of DevOps for audit or IT risk was, hey, I can do separation of duties with DevOps, right? Like there was this sort of aha moment that you could do that stuff. So we created a reference paper. It's still pretty solid today, but it was 2015, about like an unlikely union with audit and DevOps. And then I was sort of an advisor for the Dear Auditor, but it's brilliant. It's out there. It's a GitHub project. I'll talk a little more about it. It's an apology letter to the internal auditors, right? Literally, like I'll show you in a minute. It's just great. But then I met this guy named Topo Powell, and he was the first fellow at Capital One. He's just like, go Google him, watch his presentations. He was a physicist that became an IT. Those are the smartest people. Sorry. The physicists that become IT people are like, hands down, the smartest people in this industry. We just became friends, and we'd meet at Gene's wife calls it Gene's pajama party, because he gets like the smartest people on the planet in DevOps to show up for free for 3 days and just work for him and create material. But we get it back in droves. Anyway, so we started talking about like this problem of audit, internal audit, IT risk, and we just started mulling over different ideas, and that's Topo up there. So in 2017, we really, in fact, the first conversation was, could we use blockchain for something like this? And in 2017, if you mentioned blockchain in a bank, the blockchain police came and took everything that you had, your computer, your laptop, everything. Blockchain, what are you doing blockchain? It was immediate, like we probably shouldn't be using blockchain. Although the idea is perfect. So for this idea of like, how do you change the paradigm of the mess that I'm going to try to explain to you, which is developers and IT risk and internal audit. And then in 2019, we decided to write that green paper I showed you. Now I'll go into a little further. And I was fortunate to know another guy that I met through Gene's sort of pajama party thing. It was John Rezatowski. He was over at PNC. PNC is like, depending on who's counting and what you're counting by, is the 5th largest bank in the US. He came, co-authored the book, and left. I mean, literally at the airport on the way home, his feet were off the ground about that big. He's like, John, I'm going to build this. I'm going to build this. I'm going to build this. And for the next 2.5 years, he built an incredible automated governance system. And I'm going to tell you what that looks like. And then we decided to do a version 2 in 21, and we realized it was really boring. Reference architectures are like, the reason the Phoenix Project is so successful, it's based on a book called The Goal by Elliot Gorad. His theory was the way you get people interested in learning is tell it in a novel format. So that's what we did. We decided to, instead of doing a reference architecture version 2, we'd write a novella. Turns out Gene and their gang liked it so much, they asked us to stay on for a year and complete it as a novel. And then I left Red Hat about, after 3 years. It was sort of a 3-year contract. I was really sort of debating on, should I do this as a startup as myself, or, should I create a consortium? Like, I just know that, I'll say this. In 2010, I met Adam Jacob at Chef, and I knew what was going to happen in the next 10 years. Like, I knew it. I just, like infrastructure as code was like, I could see, and I'm not like a visionary, but like it was clear that there were very few of us that really got it. Actually, Nathan was one of the earliest customers before he came on board. I remember you had a t-shirt custom ink, right? And like you were like, we got it. We've totally understood it. Don't miss Nathan's presentation tomorrow. He's the only presenter. Nah, I won't say it. He's better than me. But anyway, so dear auditor, right? Like, I'm not going to force you. You'll have the deck here, but like, it's an apology letter. It's tongue in cheek, but here's the thing. Like, we promise we'll bring you along. This is the auditors, internal auditors, right? Be fully transparent. We realized it's kind of like if you go back to the beginning of DevOps. DevOps were like separate planets, right? They weren't talking to each other. They were just doing things on their own. And like Patrick Dubois, I mean, like a lot of people had the idea, but Patrick Dubois put the stake in the ground, called it DevOps, and we realized that like we needed a better way. Well, the Dear Auditor was like the apology letter for like, we've done all this great stuff in DevOps, but we're still not like bringing you to the party. In fact, the number one thing I hear in highly regulated organizations is, we've got the AppSec people on board, we're doing the DevOps good, we're doing like deploys fast, but boy, John, if you could help us figure out how to talk to the internal auditors or IT risk. There's still a chasm in most organizations where they don't know how to talk to each other. And who protects the brand? Anybody? Anybody? Who protects the brand? It's actually not the AppSec people. It's IT risk. Right? And what's usually in a Fortune 100, 500, Fortune 1000, what's the most important thing you do? Protect the brand. So in that, though I said it was tongue-in-cheek, but there was actually 53 what we called risk control matrix, RCM. And these are sort of the 10 categories. I'm not going to go into all of them, but like it was a really landmark paper because, sort of guide or whatever you want to call it. Because what we sort of addressed is everything that was sort of stirring around in security. Privileged access management, infrastructure as code, everything goes into source control. That was one of the things about Chef that was so awesome is like, and Puppet too, to Luke Kies's credit. It was about like, you didn't just put source code in source control, you put, everything, infrastructure, your YAML, well, it wasn't YAML then, but, everything. And then, separation duties. Josh Corman actually was talking about SBOMs in 2015 or 16, right? It took that long. It took an executive order in the US, so it took SolarWinds basically. But, and then, data at rest, deployment strategies. I saw launch Dark, right? Like, it's a great company, great sponsor, right? Like all the sort of ideas of how you sort of protect, business continuity, but divergence. So that was the one that sort of glared out. Started thinking about like the divergence of audit evidence versus develop evidence. Like that's why the Investors Unlimited book exists. Then, jurisdiction and, red teaming. So that was again, a lot more detail in it. It could be a presentation by itself. It's on GitHub. But the idea is like, how do we create continuous evidence? Like one of the original ideas, like could we create sort of digitally signed immutable evidence as opposed to human sort of change record? I did this, I did this, I did this. So Investments Unlimited. I just checked this morning, and it's #1 on information management. Now, let me let you in on a little secret. If your publisher knows how to game the system, you basically get a gazillion orders on day one, and it sort of stays near the top for a long time. Although the audiobook is doing really, really well. I think it's 11 on just paperback or Kindle. So, but yeah, this is the book. So, but it started with this one, which was, I said, in 2019, where Topo Powell and I said, okay, let's this year focus on this idea that the efficacy of audit and the efficacy of audit is very low and the toil is very high, right? And I'd love to hear an organization say, John, that's not how it works on our big bank. But so if you got one of those, give me a holler. And the real key, so sort of our prime objectives were, how do we turn subjective evidence into objective evidence? That's what I talked about, digitally signed, immutable entities. How do we get the auditors to trust us? Because what happens today? We create like ServiceNow records and we say, blah, 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 I did this, blah, 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 I did that, go look at this log, go look at that log. And they're like, give me the screen prints. So I always get a chuckle there because that means somebody's done this, right? Which is, like, imagine that in 2023, the way we're protecting our fort. I've interviewed people. I do this qualitative analysis where I go in and I talk to like 300 people, 200 people in a bank. And I'll find people who say, John, don't tell anybody, but I use the same screen print for 2 years of my TDD coverage. Yeah, I've seen some laughs, right? Like, yeah, I say, yeah. That's crazy. Like, we have these, like, algorithms and computers, and they can do things. Like, why are we writing our sort of digital, what is our assigned evidence in subjective discussions? And I will contend that he's getting worse. God bless all the tools that help protect us. And I'll mention a bunch of them. And a bunch of them are here, and they're great tools, like Sysdig and Lawrence Stockley, and there's another one, but getting old, excuse my memory. But one of the problems we have, without an umbrella, what we're asking the auditor's job is getting 10 times, exponentially worse. Because the change record says, go look at the system, like dog, go look at the OPA log, go look at the admin control in Kubernetes, go look, like, we have a hard time figuring that stuff, and that's what we do for a living. Get IT risk and internal audit people, like, is that the answer? A ServiceNow record points to this log, and then number one on the whatever that show is where you have to guess what the first topic is. Number one on whatever show that is for this discussion is that most of the, most of the people who will complain about it will say that it's not in the evidence or to the log, right? Like, so what are some examples? We move from, checklists to code. Right? Like, how do we know what we know? Could we invite risk and audit into a discussion of design and requirements? Yes. Could we actually raise the bar from like expecting them to read? I know I was going to say that most of the logs, we're making it worse. And I've had people say to me, John, the question we get, the number one question is, how come the SonarQube log doesn't match the Artifactory log? And they're not supposed to. But they don't understand that. But you tell them in the ServiceNow record that that's the evidence. Right? So use risk control, and then we bring the abstraction up to a higher level where the discussion is not about the Sysdig log, and again, those are tools that are absolutely necessary. And not just Sysdig, but Aquasec, I can go down the list, right? They're just top of mind right now. Those are tools that are absolutely necessary to do this thing I'm talking about. But what I want to do is raise the bar on the abstraction level so the discussions are around these abstractions so the IT risk can look at like something like a DSL and the developers can say, can we agree that there's got to be 80% test coverage? Yes, okay, we'll make the system ensure that that happens. So if it gets it from SonarQube or it gets it from wherever, it doesn't matter. Self-documenting changes, like I call them immutable, the digital sign immutable evidence. Instead of a 30-day audit, that was the other thing that we wanted to solve, right? Get rid of 30-day, 40-day, sometimes continually year-round audits to 0-day audits. Because if everything that you do is built from a DSL and an abstraction, and everything is a digitally signed evidence and is immutable, then the question during audit is, okay, has quantum computing broken RSA encryption yet? Right? No? Okay, we're good. And then audits like continuous monitoring, and and I think that's the thing that where we get into what I find what is really sort of beautiful about these type of models is that you start finding you're changing developer risk relationships from reactive to proactive. In fact, the number one thing you see is an increase of self-identified risks from developers. So that means instead of them sort of pushing back like, oh, security, don't tell them about Kubernetes because then they'll ask us for 10 more things, right? It gets to now they start using their creative mind. And by the way, our developers are incredibly smart, innovative. And for some reason, we don't give them the chance to be innovative about IT risk. But when we move to a system like this, I see it happen. I've seen it happen. It's actually a cool dashboard thing to watch. And so in the 2019 book, we basically sat down and tried to figure out, like, how do you build stages to describe DevOps automated governance or digitally signed data? And so like 7 DevOps experts, Courtney Kisser at Nike, Tova Powell, first fellow at Capital One, Sam Guggenheimer, who's pretty, like, invented infrastructure at Microsoft, and just an unbelievable list of people. And the hardest part was figuring out a way to build a pipeline structure for attestations. You would think, well, wait a minute, aren't there 4 million versions of that? Yeah, but not for what we were trying to do, which was gates and attestations. You notice, like, dependency and artifact has its own workflow. So it's dependent on the sort of the deployment build package. Another side thing was, like, it was interesting that most of them didn't think of package. You wouldn't see that as a flow, but from a attestation study, like with a jar file, it's an image, right? That became part of how you have to describe it. And so, like, some quick examples, and show you how you can sort of, it's not just sort of having, like, SonarQube or any of the sort of products that give you a lot of information that you have to use. It's about also, going back and getting sort of callback data. Like, I might know that a test ran and they all passed, but I want to know the percentage. So the check in the sort of risk control or risk as policy, risk as code could be a percentage check. We'll see that. Or clean dependencies or information leakage, right? And none of this is fantasy. I mean, this all sort of works in a couple of different solutions. And so I won't go through all these, but I've got tons of presentations. This is an updated list from the 2019. Like, we've added more over the years, but, like, you can look at, like, code quality comes SonarQube, information leakage, did it pass, test coverage has to be 80%. Now, that could be by the sort of artifact that you're deploying, right? I love, like, cyclomatic complexity, right? Like, that's, like, the auditors might not be asking for that, but man, things get really better if you actually put a threshold. Chris Brown, one of the founders of Chef, used to say, this should actually be for certain things too tall for the ride. So you can see the things. And it can be really anything, because this architecture that we've come up with is a webhook architecture with a callback for metadata. At the build stage, component, linting, SAST. Sneak was the other one. Yeah, I finally remember. Anybody having fun? Who's not having fun? That guy over there. Okay, good. Only one, so we're okay. You can have fun here and learn, right? Sorry. Yeah, if you think I'm an idiot, God bless you. So look at pre-pod stage, right? Like trusted packages. I'll have a great example of that later. If you haven't seen OpenSCAP, it's pretty interesting. And then threat monitoring, alerting, deploy strategies. And so the idea then is this idea of a sort of DSL. And I said that, look, if we could get internal audit, or probably IT risk, more important, because they're the bridge between sort of internal audit and developers in most cases. Can we get them in designer requirements? But can we have a meaningful conversation other than go look at the sneak log? But anyways, things you might be able to see, like human readable, machine interpretable, that's important. Version control, right? So the artifact itself is part of the package. It's also a digitally signed artifact, which is the DSL that used to control the mechanism of how you're verifying this stuff. Sort of pattern of the sort of pipeline artifact. We'll talk about that. Percentage. So all those things we talked about all could be modeled with some type of as code implementation. And then, of course, like, you can't mention anything about this without mentioning OPA. And so here's an example of just what we would call a component, like a risk as code to OPA. So on the top might be the risk as code YAML to basically make sure that you have a mnemonic for the artifact, right? That's really important. Especially if you're going to show, like, dashboards and all that stuff, right? I need a consistent way that's an ID, component, and version. So this is sort of an example of how you would convert the, you think of the sort of risk as code as an interface, and OPA might be the implementation. And then, there's like a couple of plugs well, I think there's only 2 in here, but the company I just went to work for, that was the other thing I was going to mention earlier, is I was going to do a startup, and then at DevOps Days DC earlier this summer, I was convinced that nobody was doing this, and I was talking to some friends about sort of I'm 63, do I really want to do my own startup over again? I've done 10 of them, right? It definitely takes years off your life. But and then I ran into this team in Oslo that literally had what I was looking for. So we sort of negotiated an opportunity, and now I work for them. So costly, right? And so this is something that was a prototype we used for the. Unfortunately, in the book, it turned out to be a black and white because it was only black and white. I guess they wanted to save money on color, but so black and white, this really does stink, right? But like this is what you see. Think about the last dashboard is for operations, and this is what you would show to the developers. And where do you show it? In Bamboo, in Jenkins, like literally, instead of just showing like all the things about the success of the implementation, be able to pull up the YAML for all those things like code quality, cyclomatic complexity, test-driven development. And I'm telling you, when you show this to a developer live, they fall off their chair. In fact, the first time Topo Pal, first fellow at Capital One, when we showed him this screen, this was a mocked-up screen of what PNC was doing. And he literally almost fell out of his chair. Like you can tell the developers all day long that you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you should have done this, you didn't do this right. Or you can get Risk in a room at design and requirements, create a DSL, and you don't get it right the first time. And you just keep getting it better and better and better. And at some point, the developers can understand exactly what they're involved in terms of risk. And they're like, we go through some of these, like, the build component, build version, quality code, right? A SonarQube thing, test coverage, right? Like it's telling me that it passed 92% test coverage. Change size, right? That's not a bad idea. Like if I'm going to go to DevOps route, I might want to make sure all the changes are less than a certain amount, right? Or cyclomatic complexity or approvers. You know, like you're going to just say in a ServiceNow record, Bob, Sue, and Jane approved it. Or are you basically going to have it like actually get the data? And then, you can go through a container scan. It was a component test that failed. And then, and then a good system will allow you to do overrides because, there might be a vulnerability that just can't be fixed right now. Something like that. So like you can override and say for this component. And so, we did the 2019 book, and one of the authors of the Investors Unlimited invited me in to talk to SolarWinds after the breach. And he's like, John, they're going to love your automated governance stuff. Cut to the chase, they didn't really get it, but I don't know. Let me say this. I've been in a lot of software companies, and nobody was doing it better or worse than SolarWinds at the time they got breached. They just happened to get really unlucky. Most software companies, I'll say this now that I don't work for a big software company, don't do a good job. They don't do as good a job as you do internally, and you may suck too. But so they brought me in, I talked to the executive team, and one of the things I noticed, if you're familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, CrowdStrike did a great job of explaining the breach to the MITRE ATT&CK frameworks with the tactic IDs. And I'm like, oh, now I am totally going to get them into automated governance because I'm going to take the CrowdStrike MITRE ATT&CK, and like all of these apply to automated governance. But remember that thing where I said these things can be risk as code and the charts that I just showed you. So a couple of things that happened there. If you didn't know what happened in SolarWinds, just quickly, the adversaries got in, sat on MS Build, were able to add their nefarious code inside of the compiled SolarWinds applications, and it got distributed out to Department of Defense, all that stuff, right? So there's a couple of things they were really clever about. Like they did some obfuscation of logs. Like you can't do that if it's digitally signed immutable evidence. If it's in a Merkle tree, which is what we use, you can't mutate it. Right? Just can't, again, unless you figure out how to do quantum computing and break RSA encryption. But and if you do that, then you're going to be in good shape for a lot of reasons. And then the other one, which was really table stakes, right? And again, I mentioned that people don't do this, but especially if it's a container, but even a jar file. These are what my good friend John Osborne calls counterfactuals, right? It's easier to sit here and say they should have done that, and they should. And I'm explaining this in a way that doesn't say they should have done that, but I'm saying they should have done that for learning purposes, if that makes sense. The fact that they weren't code signing packages, I mean, there's a good chance that would have got caught, because if they would have code signed and they knew the difference at the time that it was basically at the end of the sort of delivery chain, the hash wouldn't have matched. There would have been other code in there. I mean, there's other tools that can do that, but like that's a simple attestation. So the book, so the book is when we decided to do the version 2 of Investments Unlimited of the DevOps Automated Goals. One of the things we realized is, I thought when we wrote that 2009 book, like it was going to get downloaded. Everybody, I thought like 5 vendors were going to create it as a product. I was going to be way too late, and nobody did anything. And it was boring. That book was I think it was incredibly helpful. In fact, it's a great training guide for a new employee, because we go through all the attestations, explanations of the controls, where they come from. So, but like it didn't like download. People didn't go nuts. Software companies didn't stop in their tracks and start writing it as a product. So we sat down in 2021 to sort of let's do a version 2 with mostly what PNC had done. And they couldn't tell their story. They couldn't open source their stuff. But we decided, you know what? Let's make an unboring version and create a story, sort of like a Phoenix Project story, right? Like like the story of like things that happened. And so it was like 1,000 employees, 20 billion market cap. And here's the thing. They were a high-performance organization in DevOps. In our fictional version, they show up here. They'll come up next in the presentation and tell you the amazing things they've done in DevOps. And they probably had. But the CEO gets, I'm going to give away the plotline here, but I don't know any way to get around it. There's what they call in the United States matters requiring attention and matters requiring immediate attention, right? And a matter requiring immediate attention, most large banks, is like, you better get your crap together. Right? It is a warning. 50 MRAs are like, yes, very stern, slap on the wrist, get it fixed as soon as possible. So the story we made up was, it was this bank that had 15 open MRAs in production, customer-facing production, and the CEO gets a tip from the OCC, which is the Governance Board of Banks in the United States, that they were going to get an MRIA. She gets everybody in the room and says, wait a minute, I thought we were doing this stuff good. And they're like, yeah, but not for security. Like, whoa, explain that one to me. And that's really the story, right? So they do get an MRIA. And then we write our own version of the Dear Auditor. So like we use that, we ought to update it. The thing about this book too is there's 9 authors, which is an interesting thing to write a book with 8 other people. I've written a book with 4 people. I've written a book about 1 by just myself. But the combined expertise of the authors, like 200 years of real, Jason Cox at Disney, who at one point was 2 from the CEO, right? I mean, these are people that had stories to tell. So even though it's fictional, like everybody contributed insane real life things based on a fictional format. So it was like insane to work on this project with that much expertise. At some point, I just sit back and just like, this is great. Like, so I got a new book. I'll talk about it at the end. It's a book about Dr. Deming, and if you don't know Deming, like go read his what's called 14 Points. It should blow you away because it's a manifesto for DevOps, but it was written like 40 years ago. But his 9th point can be summarized as no silos. How many people heard of the Knight Capital story? Really? No? Oh, yeah, give us you, Nathan, of course. All right, well, it's an interesting story that happened in the U.S. It was the second largest high-frequency trader on the NYSE. And sysadmin made a mistake, again, counterfactual. John Hausberg's always yelling at me in the back of my head. That he basically was deploying an application that was an 8-cluster application, 8 servers in a cluster, and missed the 8th one. Counterfactual alert, the geniuses in development decide to repurpose a common flag. The geniuses in operation, counterfactual, for some reason didn't rebuild servers for I don't know how many years. I guess they never heard of Chef. Or they heard of Chef and they realized they didn't need it. But so when he deploys it to the 7, not 8 server, so let me ask this. How many people do any type of stock trading, commodity trading? Anybody? Nobody does any commodity trading. Come on, a couple people. All right, for y'all that do, and the rest that don't, you won't know this. But do you think it's a good policy to buy high and sell low? Anybody? I guess even the non-traders understand that one. They had a test system called PowerPeg, and it wasn't ever supposed to be turned on in production. And basically, that's what it was, a sort of a scale validation system. It got turned on in production because the 8 server had a flag that got reused. The code was sort of moved around. They didn't have peer. They probably didn't have peer reviews on check-ins. They definitely didn't have automated goes. And they lost $440 million in like 40 minutes. They were literally out of business. Second largest high-frequency trader, Algor trader on the NYSE, was out of business 24 hours. Right? And so... and you know, I realized I mixed something up, 2 stories up, but that's okay. It's a similar story. This one is also the Equifax one. So there's an Equifax breach, which they lost $5 billion market cap, very similar. The thing here about this was the silos, is that the CISO reported to the chief legal officer. Not to the CIO, to the chief legal officer. So under congressional testimony, when the CISO was asked, did you think that was odd? She said, yeah, but I figured they knew what they were doing. And then, like, there's so bleeding Conway's law here, right? When she learned about the breach, she was also asked by Congress, why do you notify the CIO? And she said, I didn't think about it. And of course she didn't think about it, because she was reporting to the chief legal officer. So in our book, Investments Unlimited, we, like in tradition of the Phoenix Project, we built an org chart. And so just so you can turn the book, you can go back and say, oh yeah, Bill, Susan, right? The CEO I talked about. Anybody see anything like so similar to the Equifax here? I mean, how do you expect to protect the fort when that's your structure? Where by design, your chief risk and compliance officer doesn't even communicate with the CISO. And in reality, a non-DevSecOps working organization, the CISO, in fact, I've had companies that are like really good at DevSecOps, like DevSecOps, and the CISO, so I've asked, I won't name the company, but a large US telco, where I asked, hey, can you invite your CISO to speak at DevOps? He said, well, she doesn't even know what DevSecOps is, right? This is what I'm talking about. We by definition, firewall our ability to communicate. So anyway, in classic Phoenix Project or goal of merry-go-round, there's always this sort of a Socratic dialogue situation. And in the actual original goal, it was Alex and Jonah. In the Phoenix Project, it was Bill and Eric. And there's always this character that just sort of knows everything, but will never tell you the answer. You got to figure it out yourself. So we built one of those. Bill Lucas is the guy that really wants to get to the bottom of this for his dear CEO, Susan. And this Jason Colbert is this bummy guy that just seems to know everything, but he's like, you must figure this out yourself. Pad 1, right? And so that's what happens. And so at some point, Jason's got everybody in the room. And they're trying to figure out, like, we're the best at DevOps. We, such and such spoke at, like, every DevOps conference. They think we're the greatest ever. And, like, and he says, this is my favorite line in the book. It says, your DevOps failed you, right? Like, I hope you get that point at this point of what I'm trying to talk about is. And so speaking of this sort of MRIA, right? So they do get the MRA, the matters requiring immediate attention. Like, these are like you better pay attention at this point. You should be paying attention to MRAs, matters requiring attention, but like MRIs are immediate attention, and the OCC, when they say immediate, they mean immediate. And so, take a look at the current state. Documented software releases, not documented. Documented testing procedures, somewhat documented. Teams do things. So the best DevOps places have DevOps sprawl. Like everybody's doing CI/CD. Right? But like they're all doing their own version of it. Because that's what we were told early on that we should do. And so they had 15 MRAs, right? Okay, 15. This is our novel. We made this up. We're like so proud of ourselves. And we get to meet the CISO from an organization called MUFG. It's a Mitsubishi North American bank that just so happened to get a cease and desist from the Office of Comptroller and Currency, the OCC, because guess what they had? They had 15 open MRAs that they ignored, and then for 18 months, and they ignored an MRIA. And they got a cease and desist. As my good friend John Marzlowski says, in a bank, if you use your banking license, you are not a bank. It was like amazing that we made up this story, and here's a story that is exactly the story we made up. Anyway, so, they go, the book is good because it walks through building a sort of online doc of like what they're going to do, and I'll let you read it. But here's the other part that I like. I think I've always been sort of like interested in the sort of, I call it the broken and blurred lines of the three lines of defense. I'll go to a place and they'll be doing DevSecOps, and John, let me show you a reference architecture. Well, we're so incredible. And then I'll talk to them about like how they do their sort of risk and internal audit. And they'll say, yeah, well, you live by the three lines of defense. So I'm like, that's basically the thing we broke with the wall of confusion, the original DevOps. If you think about these are like silos by design in between the risk owner, the second line who's supposed to be the translator to the people who protect the brand. And this model, which is basically, and it's been updated, but it's still terrible, from a DevOps perspective, or like in what I would call modern governance or continuous compliance. And in the book, Bill explains, or Jason Kolar explains why this model has to be mutated and why sort of the model that I described earlier has to be used to break this. You still can have the three lines of defense. You just need to be able to have those three teams talk to each other. We figured this out with DevOps. And like I said earlier, AppSec is not internal risk. And so the story goes that they go and they get their first cut at this, and they build an automated system that basically takes webhooks and throws everything in a mutable data store, and like things are looking good, the version, the code review, the branching pattern, right? Making sure that you're using a branching pattern that your organization wants everybody to use, code signatures, test units, quality control. And they got a room and they're like, everybody's in the company, and they demo it. And people are like looking at their phone, big deal. And it's like, wow, I got an idea. Let me do this. Let me purposely break it. Let me make one fail. And everybody stands up and gets it. So just a little moral to a story. If you're going to give a demo, show the one that doesn't work. And that's actually a true story, what that happened there at one of the banks that implemented this. So a couple more last things I want to talk about is like, that's the story. Where I want to go next is this thing I am a Deming geek. I mean, if you look at my Twitter handle picture, it's Deming. People say, is that a younger you, John? I'm like, yeah, thanks. But here's the thing I like, you can do the ML and AI stuff, and like, I'm not gonna take away, there's some definite good things, possibly great things about all that stuff, right? I'm not discounting it. But the stuff that we've been using to build toasters, cars, nuclear power plants, these are 100 years worth of intellectual property, of patterns. And the thing I realized, as we were collecting data from one of the banks on just TDD fails, in fact, what I started to do is playing around with like just piston rings, right? Tolerance levels of piston rings and variants and stuff. And I realized, oh my God, like we should be using, I was trying to explain that for my Deming book, and I realized it's the same thing for the data we have. So I took, so the idea is an what you look at so that left, yeah, I guess your left. A fly just went by, that was pretty cool. If that's an immunity version of all the test DDs. So it's basically 25 weeks of aggregated Monday through Friday test failures, ones that didn't meet the percentage, right? And it's interesting. The enumerator, right? Like it's a distribution chart, and it says, yeah, we had quite a few that were in that range, but But if I look at it, what's called a control chart, again, is the thing that there's 100 years of IP. In fact, actually 1923, Walter Shewett invented this thing. That That's the same data. So now let's look at this data. So by default, there'll be 3 sigma above, 3 standard deviations above, below. I know it's getting a little hairy, but so first thing we see is, we got 1 point at 25, the 25th week is sort of a significant, statistical significant anomaly. All right, well, that's interesting, right? But what's even more interesting is we've been doing pretty good. We've had a lower than the mean all the way up until the 17th week. And then all of a sudden we go from 17, 18 to 19, we make these incredible leaps in TDD failures. And then, so it doesn't have to be ML, right? Like literally I use the statistical cross control package in R. I had to mutate the data a little bit to give this pattern. And then all of a sudden it just rises until you get the anomaly thing. And so here's the thing. Deming said, and it could have been anybody, not just Deming, Duran, is that it's not the statistician's job to figure out the problem. It's the statistician's job to enable the subject matter expert to look for where to find the problem. When we do enumerated data in our industry, we do not give anybody a chance to figure out that. Remember, same data, right? It's the same data. That tells us quite a bit. It doesn't tell us what's wrong. So in that particular example, again, I made it a little, I had to condense it, I had to sort of package it so I present it, but it's real data, right? Is that when the subject matter expert, the people who did the release and all that stuff, found out that they had added like 10 new developers to a development team, and they hadn't had the TDD training yet. Never in a million years figure that out from that. So, I'm sort of a man on a mission, a person on a mission here. I mean, so I've talked to. I love what don't miss Nathan's presentation tomorrow. I think what Nathan and gang have done to the original Accelerate data is really important. I mean, Accelerate data originally was very important. I think it sort of got stale. I'm opinionated about a lot of things, but I think. In discussions with Nathan and, at DevOps DC, I think he's got it right. He gets it. And so I think, there's just so much data from there that, if we want to start playing with analytical data, like the modern governance, think about all those things I showed you that I could now start using as analytical statistics. Again, I could throw ML at it, and then I got to build models, and I got to do models, and I got to be, one of the things about the modeling, yeah, screw it. Yeah, the thing about the modeling is it by definition separates the subject matter expert from the modeler. I mean, I'm telling you right now, there's very few people who really understand the stuff I showed on those green screens earlier that can build ML models, right? Whereas in analytical statistics, it's just statistics. Right, and so I mean, look, if I start taking modern governance like psychometric complexity, what is my trend for psychometric complexity? Does that within process normal, or does it jump around? TDD. I mean, think about all those things. If I could just start feeding that in and just build control charts and start looking at the aggregate, I mean, it's just incredible. And the other thing too is, it's how nuclear power plants behave. I joke it's how they make toasters, but it is how they make toasters. And then the DORA explores a lot more than modern governance, right? Like SRE practices. I get people that tell me all the time, I would never do error budgeting. Well, Deming would say, that's a real stupid thing without data. There's a thing called Plan, Do, Study, Act, right? Go and see if you can basically do it and if it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense in the study act, I just say in our industry, we are incredibly good at plan, do, plan, do, plan, do, plan, do. It's scientific method. It's that simple. If you want to read a great book, Mike Rother's Toyota Kata. He calls it Toyota Kata. So all the SRE data, there's some really good stuff. But as a large bank, no disrespect to Google, but you can't just go do the Google way in a large bank in SRE. You have to have some pragmatic evolution. But you can do it But you got to do sort of what Rother calls kata, what Deming would call PDSA, what sort of Francis Bacon would call the scientific method. And then skills liquidity. One of the things that Deming says, what I think is really cool, like if you look at these sort of control charts, and so imagine everything's sort of normal. So normal is somewhere bouncing between the mean, right? And not beyond the upper control or lower control limit. And so things are normal, but it still sucks, right? Well, then there's probably two ways to go look for what's going on. One is maybe there's a gap in our skills liquidity. Or two, maybe the people we have doing that job are not tall enough for the ride, right? But the point is, we don't just fire somebody or not give them a bonus or give them a bonus based on based on sort of random non-scientific data. And by the way, that's what we do. So anyway, I have a book. It's been my life dream. It's about Dr. Deming, and this is the shameless or non-shameless plug. The first 100, because the first 250 people will get if you sort of get on the waiting list. By the end of December, we're going to do a 3-chapter audio teaser, not on Audible, so it'll just be a crypto file. And, so you get it, and then you'll be on the waiting list for the long book. You don't have to commit anything other than sign up the waiting list. And it's an incredible book. It's 10 years of research. It's a story that's so relevant to what we do. Anyway, I have those. I put some out on the registration booth. Oh, if you haven't seen DALL-E, this OpenAI stuff, how many people have heard of OpenAI? It generates pictures. It's like crazy. So I put in John Willis and Botchagalupe, and that's what I got. Isn't that cool? All right, y'all. Thank you so much. I'll be around all next 2 days. I'd love to have conversations about any of this. Thanks again.